Hey, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode of Hearts Wine from Harsh Distractions, the podcast where we talk real talk about love, relationships, and everything in between. Yes, I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most important yet sneaky aspects of relationships, codependency. Y'all heard it. Now, you might be thinking, what is this even a thing? I'm just in love. Trust me, love is amazing, but sometimes it can sneakily turn into something that pulls us away from our own identity. And that's where we need to be cautious. So let's get into it. Is your relationship healthy or are you codependent? So, I want to start with a simple question, if I may. How often do you spend time doing something that makes you, you? I mean, no partner involvement, no relationship duties, just you, your passions, your hobbies, and your me time. Do you remember what that feels like? You might be surprised how easily it gets lost in the hustle of a relationship. And here's the thing, if you're constantly looking for your partner to fill that void, you could be falling into the trap of codependency. But wait, let's back up a bit. What exactly is codependency? I'm sure y'all want to know, right? Well, to put it simply, it's when your sense of self gets so intertwined with theirs that you forget where you end and they begin. It sounds intense, right? But it's more common than you might think. So let's break it down, shall we? Codependency is not the same as interdependence, where you and your partner rely on each other but still have separate identities. Codependency, however, often involves one person becoming overly reliant on the other for their emotional well-being. And that can lead to unhealthy dynamics where one person gives too much and the other takes too much. The relationship becomes unbalanced and both partners may end up feeling unsatisfied. This might sound like a heavy topic, but don't worry. We're going to break it down and make sure you walk away with some real actionable tips. Now, we all know relationships take work, but when the scales tip and you start losing your own sense of identity in the process, things can get tricky. So, today's episode is all about recognizing the red flags that might signal you're losing yourself in your relationship and how to reclaim your individuality without losing that connection with your partner. Let's get into it. Yes, I'm your relationship expert with over 20 years of professional and personal experience. Now I get to be your host in addition to being a wife, a mother, a marriage and family therapist. If you didn't know, I'm someone who's passionate about helping people navigate the ups and downs of love and relationships. Of course, yes, I understand relationships on all levels, right? And I like to call out the things that most people don't acknowledge, especially when it includes their generational patterns from their family, as well as like relationships, friendships, and mental health. I'm also a relationship coach, an entrepreneur of two businesses, and the author of Distractions of the Heart, a poetry book all about the messy, beautiful emotions and relationships we experience and carry in our hearts. And when I'm not having deep conversations or helping others, you might catch me mixing up a drink or two. I'm a bit of a mixologist at heart who enjoys pretty much coming up with new flavored cocktails. So grab your glass of wine, get comfortable, and let's talk about all the heart's distractions that cause your heart to whine in your new favorite relationship podcast. Okay, let's start by talking about what we mean when we say codependency. It's one of those terms that gets tossed around a lot. But what does codependency really look like in action? Well, imagine this. You're planning a date night, but you can't enjoy yourself because you're obsessing over whether your partner is having a good time. Or maybe you're constantly thinking, what can I do to make them happy? even when your own needs are getting pushed aside. If this sounds familiar, you might be seeing the signs of codependency. Sometimes it can start with little things like always needing to check in with your partner or relying on them for emotional support constantly. Hear that word, constantly. Over time, these behaviors can become patterns that erode your individuality. In its simplest form, codependency happens when one person loses their sense of self in their relationship and becomes overly reliant on the other person for their emotional well-being. And I want to be clear here. It's not always this obvious. It doesn't happen overnight. It definitely sneaks up on you. Now, you might be wondering, isn't that just part of being in a relationship? Well, yes and no. Being in a relationship does require emotional connection and support, but healthy relationships maintain a balance. One partner doesn't need to be a caretaker or a fixer for the other. Each person should still have their own sense of self and purpose outside of the relationship. So let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you're always checking in with your partner, but not because you want to, but because you feel like you have to. Your whole day revolves around their emotional needs, and you start to neglect your own. Maybe you don't even realize it at first. You tell yourself, I'm just being supportive, or it's just part of being in a relationship. And while that's true to an extent, the problem here is when this behavior becomes the default. Your sense of self gets wrapped up in constantly being there for them, and eventually you forget what it feels like to just be you. Research shows that people who fall into codependent relationships often experience emotional burnout because one person is carrying the weight of the relationship's emotional needs. Does that sound familiar? Well, according to marriage and family therapy experts such as myself, codependency is often rooted in childhood experiences of neglect or emotional immaturity. It's not your fault. It's just a behavior pattern that can be learned over time. Imagine being a passionate writer when you and your partner first met. You love to go to coffee shops, listen to indie music, and lose yourself in novels. But over a few months, you start spending more and more time with your partner. But your partner, on the other hand, was someone who needed a lot of reassurance. Your partner didn't feel secure in themselves, and you naturally began adjusting your routine to support your partner, such as checking in constantly, sacrificing your own hobbies to comfort them when they were feeling down. What happened? You lost your spark, and your partner, while not intentionally trying to change you, became emotionally dependent on you. Both of you got stuck in this loop of giving too much to each other and eventually realized you both were losing yourselves in each other. This, my friends, is classic codependency. And you might be thinking, but it's not like they were bad people, right? No, not at all. They were just caught in a cycle that, left unchecked, could have sabotaged their happiness in the long run. It's like this unspoken rule. If your partner's happy, then everything's fine. But the truth is, when you lose yourself in your partner's needs, things start to get out of balance. And that's when codependency can do some damage. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not about never being there for each other emotionally. That's part of what makes a relationship strong. But when you become your partner's emotional crutch and vice versa, the foundation starts to crack. It's not healthy for either person, and the relationship starts to feel less like a partnership and more like a rescue mission. Hello, hear me on that one. So now that we have a clear picture of what codependency looks like, let's talk about the red flags. These are the things that, if you notice them, should make you pause and say, Hold on, are we going down a dangerous path? Let's talk about that because it's easier than you think to fall into these habits without even realizing it. Red flag number 1, you're losing your personal interest and hobbies, meaning you're losing yourself. Think about the last time you spent time doing something for you. I'm talking about something that had absolutely nothing to do with your partner. If that feels like a distant memory, or if you can't remember the last time you did something just for yourself, that's a major red flag. In the beginning of a relationship, it's easy to focus all your energy on your partner. But if you start abandoning your own passions, whether it's painting, hiking, or just hanging out with friends, that's a big sign that something might be off. A healthy relationship shouldn't mean you have to give up your hobbies, your friends, or your personal goals. But when you start sacrificing those things because you feel like you have to, well, that's when the individuality starts to slip away. Red flag number 2. The next sign is a little more subtle. It's that feeling of responsibility. Feeling like it's your job to make your partner happy all the time, meaning you feel responsible for your partner's happiness. Hear me on this one, y'all, because this one about to get deep. Maybe they're having a rough day, and suddenly you feel like you must drop everything and fix it. Or you're constantly checking in, making sure they're okay emotionally, mentally, physically, etc. Look, it's natural to care about your partner's emotional well-being, but if you start feeling like it's your job to keep them happy all the time, you're stepping into codependency territory. No one should rely solely on another person for happiness. It's one thing to support your partner, but it's another thing entirely when you feel like their happiness is your burden to carry. Now, let's talk about the third red flag. When you can't make a decision without thinking about how it will affect your partner, meaning you can't seem to do anything without your partner's approval. Have you ever tried to make a decision without something on your own but felt paralyzed because you did not know how your partner would react? Or worse, you avoid doing something you enjoy because you're worried it might upset them. And the moment you start considering it, you catch yourself wondering, how will my partner feel about this? And before you know it, your plans get tossed out the window just to keep the peace. You stop trusting yourself and looking inward to make choices, and instead, you begin to make decisions based on what you think your partner will approve of. It's a serious red flag. And lastly, red flag number 4, we've got that blurry emotional boundary situation. You know, when you're constantly fixing things for your partner or putting their needs first at the expense of your own, it might feel natural at first. It might even feel noble to put them first all the time. But over time, you start neglecting your own needs. And that's where resentment can creep in. You begin to feel like you've given so much of yourself to the relationship, but you haven't received much in return. And that's when things start to feel imbalanced. Who wants that? I know I don't, but I get it. These might feel a little harsh, but honestly, being real about the red flags is the first step towards fixing things. And hey, if you're listening and thinking, wait a minute, that sounds a little too familiar, don't worry, you're not alone. The good news is, recognizing these signs is the first step towards making a change and building a more balanced, healthier relationship. And let's be real, sometimes codependency feels like this. You're scrolling through your partner's social media because they're not responding to your texts fast enough. But is that love? Or is it just the need for reassurance? Spoiler alert, it's the latter. Hear me on this one? Now, let's talk about how codependency affects relationships. Because let's face it, this isn't just about doing little things that seem harmless at first. Left unchecked, codependency can be a major roadblock to true happiness. When you're giving all of your emotional energy to your partner, whether it's being constantly available to comfort them or worrying if they're okay, it can start to take a toll on your emotional well-being. Imagine this. You're always the one who's putting your partner's needs ahead of your own. Every time they're upset, you drop everything to make them feel better. You ignore your own feelings because you're so focused on theirs. Now, here's the problem. You're getting drained, right? You feel like you're giving and yet you're not getting that same energy in return. What happens? You start resenting your partner. You start feeling exhausted, maybe even a little bitter, but you don't know how to step back. What's even more dangerous is that this cycle can affect the emotional depth of your relationship. You're not connecting at an authentic level anymore. Instead, it's more like you're constantly performing, playing the role of the caretaker, the fixer, the one who has to hold everything together. And that's not sustainable. Eventually, both partners feel like they're losing their individuality, and that sense of self is what makes a relationship rich and fulfilling. In fact, research from marriage and family therapy shows that couples in codependent relationships often have a hard time communicating effectively. It's like they're both stuck in the same loop, unable to break free and have real conversations about their needs and desires. When one person is overly dependent, it can also stunt the other person's growth emotionally and individually. Take a moment to think about this. When was the last time you felt free to make decisions that were solely about you? I'm talking about your needs, your growth, your happiness, without worrying about how your partner would feel. It's important to know that in a healthy relationship, both partners can feel safe to pursue their individual dreams while still coming together for shared experiences. That's the difference between codependency and interdependence. All right, now we're going to take a step back and look at something that might surprise you. Generational patterns. Okay, maybe that wasn't so surprising because I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm just saying. But yes, the way our parents, grandparents, and even our great grandparents handle relationships can have a massive influence on how we show up in our own. It's like an invisible force passed down through the generations, shaping how we view love, partnership, and emotional needs. Think about it. How did the people who raised you handle their relationships? Were they emotionally available to each other, or did one person seem to carry the emotional load of the family? Maybe one partner always seemed to put the other on a pedestal, and their happiness was completely tied to the other's well-being. Or maybe you saw someone take on the role of the fixer, constantly putting out emotional fires, but never really tending to their own needs. These patterns aren't always easy to spot, but they're there, and they can get passed down intentionally or not. This is where things get tricky. If you grew up watching your parents or caregivers be emotionally dependent on each other, it might seem normal to carry that same pattern into your own relationships. Maybe you've internalized the idea that love equals constant emotional caretaking, or that showing love means sacrificing your own needs for the sake of the other person. For example, if you saw a parent putting their emotional needs aside to keep the peace in a marriage, you might start thinking, that's just how relationships are supposed to work. Put others first, and you'll be loved. Oh my God. Did y'all hear that? That just did not make any sense to me, but that is how some people operate. But here's the thing. These generational habits are often ingrained in us without even realizing it. We don't reflect on these things, people. We think we're doing what we're supposed to do when we start to overcompensate for our partner's emotions, or when we abandon our own hobbies, passions, and needs to focus entirely on them. They can create a cycle of codependency that repeats itself from one generation to the next. But it doesn't have to stay that way. So how do we break free? First, we need to recognize it. We need to ask ourselves, what relationship patterns did I inherit? What did I see growing up, and how has that influenced how I approach love now? For example, maybe you grew up in a home where your parents didn't talk about their feelings, or one parent always took care of the other emotionally no matter what. Those patterns may have subtly taught you that you need to take care of others' emotional needs at the cost of your own. But recognizing that you might have inherited these patterns is the first step to breaking them. Once you become aware of it, you can choose to do things differently. You can create a healthier dynamic in your own relationship, one that encourages both partners to stand as equals and make space for personal growth while still deeply caring for each other. Let me give you an example. Maybe you've noticed that in your relationship, one of you tends to be the caretaker, always looking after the other person's emotional well-being, financial stability, whatever. But sometimes at the expense of your own. You might have inherited that dynamic from your parents, and without even realizing it, you're repeating that cycle. So what's the solution? The first step is to openly talk about it with your partner. Discuss where these patterns might come from and agree to shift the way you both approach emotional needs. Start creating a new cycle where both partners are responsible for their emotional health rather than one person bearing the burden. Research in family systems therapy has found that codependent behaviors are often passed down from generation to generation as individuals unconsciously replicate emotional dynamics from their upbringing. According to therapist Dr. Roberta G. Moyer, our relationship styles are heavily influenced by our parents' behaviors, even if we don't realize it. Yes, I'm drilling this in so y'all can hear me, people, because I know it's tough and I get it. I've inherited things too, right? But we're talking about unraveling years of learned behavior. But once you realize that these generational patterns are not set in stone, you gain the power to break them. And when you do, you start building a relationship that's healthier and more balanced. One where both of you feel empowered to show up as your true, authentic selves. All right. So now that we know what codependency is and how it can negatively affect our relationships, let's talk about something super important here. How do you distinguish between your personal needs and your partner's needs? It's one thing to be supportive, but it's another thing entirely when you're abandoning your own desires to serve someone else's emotional needs. Oh my God. Did y'all hear me say that? I'm going to say it one more time for y'all. It's one thing to be supportive, but it's another thing entirely when you're abandoning your own desires to serve someone else's emotional needs. One of the first steps in breaking free from codependency is learning to differentiate between I need this for me versus I'm doing this because my partner expects me to. Here's a little exercise to help you start recognizing your own needs. Think back to the last time you did something for yourself, something that made you feel fulfilled. Did it involve your partner, or was it something you just did for you? A hobby, a solo activity, taking yourself out to dinner, maybe even spending time with your friends. If you can pinpoint moments when you were connected to your own sense of self, you're on the right track. I get it though. Relationships are a balancing act. You want to be there for your partner, and of course, you should want to support them emotionally. But you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So here's a simple but often overlooked tip. Give yourself permission to focus on your own emotional needs. And guess what? That doesn't mean you're neglecting your partner. It just means you're not letting go of your own identity. I've seen couples struggle with this. One partner wants to be everything to the other, but over time, they start losing sight of who they are. The key here is to take responsibility for your own emotional well-being while also supporting your partner in a healthy, non-pressuring way. And attached by Amir Levine, he writes, the key to a secure relationship is maintaining a sense of self while being there for each other in meaningful ways. It's all about balance. Don't let your relationship be your whole identity. Keep a piece of yourself, too, for you. Now, let's dive into the fun part. How to fix this. Because breaking free from codependency and building a healthier relationship is totally possible. The key is to be intentional about maintaining your individuality, even while being in a relationship. First things first, set boundaries. That's right. Good old-fashioned boundaries. That might sound like a curse word to some people, but we need them. Emotional boundaries are crucial. When you start feeling like your partner's emotional state is affecting your own, it's time to check in with yourself. Are you taking on too much? Are you overcompensating for their emotional needs? If the answer is yes, it's time to set some limits. Now, I know what you're thinking, but I don't want to seem distant or uncaring. And I get it, but setting boundaries doesn't mean you're pushing your partner away. It just means you're taking responsibility for your own emotions and encouraging your partner to do the same. Remember, a healthy relationship is where both partners are secure in themselves while still deeply connected to each other. Another tip, reconnect with your own passions and hobbies. If you've lost sight of what makes you tick, take a step back and explore what excites you. Maybe it's something you used to love doing, but stop for whatever reason. Reclaim that space for yourself. And guess what? It's okay to say, I need time to do this for me. It's not selfish. It's necessary for your well-being and the security of your relationship. Here's something that may sound a little counterintuitive. Sometimes you need to be apart to grow together. Oh, Jesus, fix it. Yes, I did say that, and I'm going to say it again. Sometimes you need to be apart to grow together. It's healthy to spend time away from each other, doing your own thing. And when you come back together, you'll have more to share and discuss. This is the kind of space that encourages both partners to grow within the relationship while still preserving their individuality. I always laugh when people say, we have to do everything together. Sure, date night is important, but you don't need to watch every single movie your partner watches to feel connected. You can both enjoy your own activities and still have plenty of things to bond over when you're together. Lastly, practice open communication. Talk to your partner about your needs and listen to theirs. When you both understand that you're each responsible for your emotional health, it creates a much stronger foundation for a healthy, fulfilling relationship. So there you have it. Codependency might seem like an easy trap to fall into, but it doesn't have to define your relationship, nor you. By recognizing the signs, setting boundaries, and nurturing your individuality, you can break free from these unhealthy patterns and build a stronger, more balanced connection with your partner. I want to leave you with this thought. Love should enhance who you are, not take away from it. When you're able to stay true to yourself, you're better equipped to give love in a way that's healthy and supportive. So go ahead, embrace your me time, as I like to call it, and encourage your partner to do the same. Your relationship will thank you for it. Trust me. And hey, if you enjoyed today's conversation, make sure you subscribe to Hearts Wine from Harsh Distractions on YouTube for exclusive episodes and content. Visit us at www.aliciasdistractions.com for more resources and updates. And don't forget to follow us on social media, on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And if you haven't already, also, go get my book, Distractions of the Heart, under my author name, Alicia Marie. Thanks for tuning in, And I'll catch you next time on Hearts Wine from Harsh Distractions, where we turn our relationship struggles into our sweetest moments of growth. Cheers.